I think it is time.
I
I've been trying to agree to start Ty been kindly agreed to start us off with a tentative exposition of his project. Could you begin, please, Ty?
Sure. So emphasis on tentative. No. I thought I'd start by just touching on a few main arguments I think I'll probably end up making in the paper, and then just like marshal some of the ideas and evidence we've discussed so far in the course, and then maybe end with like some questions and a specific focus on the readings for this week and how I think it syncs up with what I've said. So I think my project, I'm seeking to argue that the dominant vision of high growth, high redistribution, high right society is within our reach, and is, accessible to us now, but for some well-identified barriers. That this vision has not been given a proper chance in the 21st century, that this vision could serve as a stepping point to the novel social arrangements and economic orders Professor Unger idealizes, that this first phase of social effort would address a number of concerns we've discussed in the class, such as hot democracy, creative structural policy change, and even perhaps a different vision for the legal field, which I think is already in motion. And then I want to offer a critique of some of the hypothetical alternatives that we might come up with, and note that the reality that these are hypothetical is a big trade-off considering how advanced the current project of this sort of high growth, high redistribution, high rights vision is already in sort of, we're already far along there, so it's quite a cost to switch courses. And then also end with the questions of sort of one main theme being that to the extent we have problems in our status quo or barriers to change, that's because of an intentional opposition force of elites and people with power and privilege, and it's hard to understand why those would disappear or why those actors would have a different view in approaching alternative models. And then also, so to maybe answer the question then, do we need new ideas and more models of the different social and economic arrangements we can make, or do we need to focus on how to effectively implement and lead in the current moment we're in? So switching gears a little just to some of the more detailed focus, I think we started this class acknowledging great inequality, an elite ruling class, deadlocked government institutions, predetermined and perhaps arbitrary market order. Professor Unger has two critiques, one of formalism and one of objectivism, at least in regard to the law. And sort of the first idea is that there isn't as much a distinction as we might assume between lawmaking and applying the law. And jump in if I'm misinterpreting what we've gone over. And then sort of the second critique focuses on sort of this continuing need to be validating and filling in holes in our legal structure through continuing court opinions and sort of making these ad hoc adjustments without really addressing the important critical flaws and missing pieces. And then I think we come to the conclusion that because of all these issues, we need some sort of major reorientation or shift. I think one thing that's going to be interesting to discuss definitely is what is structural change and what's not structural change. I think that's something I'm struggling to maybe wrap my head around as we've discussed it so far in the class, so I would love input on that. And then just to jump to some comments Professor Unger's given on maybe a new vision or project for the law with an eye towards the knowledge economy. I'm just going to read some quotes. So, the role for legal thought in the knowledge economy, Professor Unger has said, is to inform the public conversation about possible systems of structural change. So this is like a higher order task. He envisions, the law beyond courts and judges and litigation, and sees lawyers as perhaps playing a role where they have the prophetic task of marshaling The contradictions manifest in the law towards the creation of a higher form of life. He continues, there is no country in the world with greater vitality and energy, where the majority of ordinary men and women continue to believe that anything is possible, that we can become more human by becoming more godlike. The object of democracy is to divinize humanity. We can and should become bigger together. So I think that none of this conflicts necessarily so far with what I see as the key proposals and visions in I don't know that we have to bucket it as like the Democratic Party agenda, but like this agenda that aims towards closing inequality gaps and redistributing wealth and rights. And so just gonna run through some of the bigger ideas and leave the question on each of them, would we consider this structural change or not? So just to start, President Biden's agenda started with a $3.5 trillion spending bill proposal to address things from the economy to education to immigration reform to climate change. Is that structural change? So, and then, just a more specific idea, pathway to citizenship for 8 million undocumented immigrants. Is that structural change? Obviously, it would change those individuals' lives, and that's a massive amount of people. And then you see people playing with laws in creative ways, which I think, the law is foundational to each of these ideas in some way. New York, I think, is starting this week to allow non-citizens of some sort of parameters to engage in the voting process. Is that structural change? So I think we have some of these experimentation ideas, but I'm just going to continue, cutting child poverty in half is part of, the Biden COVID relief package. Is something that's going to change the lives of, again, millions of kids. Structural change, or is that not enough? The idea that, the president hasn't supported, but other leaders in this moment have, is, calling on the Department of Education to push the boundaries of its legal authority and cancel $1.61 trillion of student debt for 43 million Americans. Again, that would seem to me to be probably a structural change. It's an issue that particularly affects women and minorities as well. And again, it relies on using the law not sort of as is, but coming up with a creative solution to a problem, yes, constricted by the Constitution and sort of the way things are already done, so that is a limit. But I think, we've identified a number of ways where when there's a problem, the legal solution is creative to get it done based on agreements that already happened. Again, National Popular Vote Plan, to me that's a radical proposal that, is well on its way to getting done. To move out of the Electoral College, and then you have ideas like the wealth tax, the health impact fund, automatic voter registration, UBI. So that's kind of the world that I see of policy ideas. And then I think the reason that we haven't been able to address this is because of a problem that's well established that we know, and that is sort of lack of access to voting, an orchestrated effort by institutional leaders to limit, certain groups' power at the polls, but also sort of the general socioeconomic inequalities that interfere with a thriving democracy. And we do have institutional barriers, and I think Professor Unger acknowledges, which I agree with, that our system's design is to kind of create this deadlock, and checks and balances are sort of taken as critical in the design of our system, but perhaps that's holding back change. At the same time, I feel like without that, and perhaps we can use the Trump presidency as an example, I'm not sure that empowering the executive, as I think is one proposal, solves a lot of those problems when there's sort of this ill intent. And I think like a common theme that I view as sort of almost a non-starter with some of the hypothetical alternatives is that we do have this history, and moreover, we have this like very intentional animosity that's getting in the way of change making or moving towards equality. And so I'm not sure how we've explained that that's going to disappear, and if that doesn't disappear, then how do we execute any of these other ideas? So shifting now to some of the hypothetical alternatives, I think, like, again, in defense of the current system, there is a logic to the rules and systems we have, so I wouldn't necessarily dismiss them as arbitrary, and I know we spent a lot of time discussing that, but they do reflect, a certain level of power and history and control, and to sort of work within that system to kind of undo, first of all, the structural damage of that history is an idea rooted in principles of fairness and equality. It doesn't mean that we have to accept it, but I think that deviating from that approach, because we can't start from zero, seems to favor, in every scenario that I can think of at least, this sort of working class where like the white working class part is silent, and we're giving up on some other interest of gender equality or racial equality, and maybe that's just something that I'm hearing. But I do see that as an issue because we can't make all these changes at once. We do have to start somewhere, so it does seem fair to start in order of where the society that's benefited from whatever's happened in the past has created this damage and should do something to actively correct it. And I guess this leaves us with like the devil you know versus devil you don't trade-off. But again, then I'm coming back to this point of sort of elites won't suffer from, first of all, this experimentation and changing systems. I think the most suffering, with change is going to always be at the bottom of the pecking order, no matter how you do it. So if you want to be really creative and say, okay, let's do this like voice credit voting system, and it goes terribly awry, it's not going to be the people with billions of dollars and tons of power that like suddenly have their voice silenced or don't have access to participation in democracy. So I think that's an important consideration. And then I think we're also missing this justification of, because inequality and limited change are baked into the system on purpose, why would these forces that have put it there kind of suddenly disappear? And to the extent that we could overcome those forces, or that we could all get together and sort of agree on these changes, isn't that threshold much higher than the threshold it would take to simply empower the democracy that we already have, implement some of the big ideas and changes that I started out with, and go from there? I'm not sure. And then just sort of touching quickly on some of the key points from the readings for today. So again, this voice credit idea, it seems hard to analyze when we're living in a democracy again, where some people have to wait 11 hours in line to vote. They're already kind of showing a greater interest in somebody who can vote 15 minutes. And so without that sort of baseline equality, which we haven't established, and there's no reason to believe we would establish if we switch to a different, more creative system, it seems to be like confounding something that's already incredibly complicated, already not working, and I'm not seeing, how that would lead to progress. Or then sort of shifting to this idea about, moving past this sort of paralysis we have because we're designing a system that's not going to be overcome by populism. Are we comfortable moving away from that when we sort of have just seen a mini version of the fervor of populism in the January 6th insurrection, in the last 4 years of Trump? I don't feel comfortable that we don't need that anymore. And then sort of the idea of accelerating politics, again, same risks of empowering the executive to make change faster. Like, do we have a popular will that is good and that is educated and that should be driving change faster? I'm going to say no. And some ideas to accelerate the process as well, I think, they could work out or they could be terrible. Mandatory voting, is that good? I don't think it's great. So, again, we could try that. Maybe some locality could try that. But I don't see these as solutions to the ultimate problem of division, racism, and sort of hate that we carry with us. And so I think the proposal at the end of this, at least, is sort of, and in the left alternative, I just isolated a quote, I'm wrapping up here, but it means to, one principle of this vision for the left should be, it means to never reduce social solidarity to mere money transfer. Social solidarity must rest instead on the sole secure basis it can have direct responsibility of people for one another. But we're so far from that reality and moment in this country that I think the question is, why would we start with an idea that requires social solidarity when perhaps we need to use the the sort of coercive powers that already exist to kind of force equality and then go somewhere together after that. So.
Well, thank you so much, that's great. So before I join the conversation, let me ask the class to address your questions. Can you please interrogate Jonathan?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is an interrogation. It's more just like a thought that I had. You mentioned kind of early on this Biden's $3.5 billion relief package. And you kind of said like that might be kind of considered structural change and might not. It's unclear. It can have really meaningful change, especially you said like child poverty. My question is like why do we want to focus on that type of structural change and not something else? So like my first thought is, I don't know, like maybe structural change of like the prison system, for example. Why would we not want to focus on that first? And it's not something that there's a right answer to, but it's something that you can kind of dig into to see like where might the change actually be most structural and actually have the biggest difference. And then my other thought was kind of relating to individual responsibility. There's this idea that like individuals are responsible for their outcomes. I don't agree with it. I think I don't think you would based on what you just said, but I think it is something that should be addressed in any sort of proposal of change. So maybe there's something in there where you can kind of address why, like, should it be the executive that makes these changes? Should it be the courts? How much responsibility falls on the individuals? Something like that.
Thanks.
Do you want to respond, Kyle?
Oh, yeah, I mean, so I totally agree. I think, to some extent, I would say it's arbitrary how they're coming up with the 3.5 trillion spending package, and I'm sure actually, if we looked it up, I'm sure there's something on, investing in incarcerated communities and reforms there. I think it's part of, again, though, the creative ideas and like the bigger, I think the one-offs that are on the path that we're already on of change, so whether it's the prison system or the healthcare industry, like those are big issues to deal with, but I'm not seeing like scrap everything and start over as like the most helpful way to deliver outcomes to people, because we are already well on the way, and we have, basically if we had one more senator, right, all of these changes suddenly become much more possible. So it seems to me like giving up because of that little margin is a massive risk to take on behalf of the most vulnerable, and also doesn't necessarily solve a lot of the problems to the extent the problem is fundamentally an inner sort of human level of, bigotry, hate, not coming together that I think we do have in the country.
I could see something just real quick, like there at the end, I kind of see like a little bit of a dichotomy. It sounds like you're thinking is like we're close to making change through the law, but we're also not, because these changes are also like very much like personal, views on the world. And I mean, I don't know, that's just a comment I know that I just saw. It sounds like it's changed, at least in your mindset, and I would agree with you, it has to come from both sides, it can't just be just one.
Can I just ask, I know this is easier said than done, but what is your thesis in a sentence, if you can?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't have it. But I think the thesis would be that the idea of, sticking with the W you know as opposed to the W you don't. And I think, sort of the meandering themes that I went through do orient around that, because first, I think I reject the idea that what we are doing is a completely failed project that we should abandon, which I think is central to establishing the alternate hypotheses that we could come up with of, what might work and might not. and then identifying some of the ways in which there is common ground with some of the critiques we've discussed in the class, but that we're very much on track and we sort of know quite well what the barriers to achieving that progress are, and they're sort of isolated and can be addressed with some level of coming together and social organizing and voting and engaging the legal system as is to change it. And so it doesn't seem logical that some other project, which is necessarily going to have some higher threshold of energy and participation and collaboration to even get started, is the solution. I don't know, I guess that's kind of where I'm at in this moment.
So Carmen, would it be fair to say that you're responding to your question, that your central thesis is that the established agenda of the American progressives, which one could loosely describe as an agenda of redistribution and inclusion, is superior to any of the apparent alternatives? That it's a better bet at many different levels. Is that your main idea?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So I'm actually very sympathetic to your position, but one of the bigger obstacles I have to the current agenda, if you will, is the sense that it's always a point that you have a reform point and you have struggle, the problem starts growing, and it's a massive effort to solve smaller problems individually over. So first question is, do you think that is the case as well?
Can you give like one more
The biggest one is kind of, so how we have the labor markets now organized. So just to give an example, it started with like the 40s when you have middle class that grew on the tail of industries, and the high school degree you can have a very good salary and pension and stuff. And it quickly evolved to a situation now where you have Uberization of the economy, the few companies that have knowledge, commoditize labor to the point where you have, it's pretty brutal, the labor market, if you're not in the knowledge economy. And then the solution for that is what? Giving UBI and hoping that they'll be trained into doing something. There's something and satisfying in that, and so that's an example of what I'm thinking. Like there is this massive structural problem, and it looks like you're throwing a band-aid, which sure it fixes in the short term, but the problem still will grow again. The first question is, do you think that is the case? And then the second is, like, how do you think that will?
I guess I'd say, like, I would love to see a system where we had a robust minimum wage and a lot of tax on companies like Uber and a lot of regulation of companies like Uber, maybe even data sharing agreements or something like that, or something that, localizes the model, or break up Facebook, do all of those things. But I don't see them as, I think it's well-designed policy that all works together when you can get it all done. We haven't necessarily had a moment where we get it all done. But I don't think, first of all, I think there is something unique about the United States where we are coming up with, the Ubers, the Apples, the Amazons, and able to make that explosive growth. And so I think it's different than comparing it to a country that's much more homogenous, has shared values, and isn't generating those explosions of wealth. Like, I think that's working for America to some extent if you're just focused on maximizing growth, but we know that comes with so many bad things. So we really have to then, sort of be honest about the damage that it causes to do that and reinvest that in a way that we are educating a new workforce and we are giving people tons of opportunities, and the government is funding not only education but maybe creative businesses. I mean, what is it, like Tesla got $5 billion of government support and welfare, and now it's a huge successful company, but we can do things like that. But when we all share in it, I think that's the key. When we're not sharing in it, but it would seem to me we're closer to that.
Yeah, there's just that the reason why I'm skeptical is you can construct a regulation for sharing, but over time it kind of washes out. Right? Like we had a decent middle class that was supported by a good regulatory state, and then once technology, like the new internet came in, now you broke all the barriers that were intermediated the relationship between consumer and producer, and now you have so Uber's. So I disagree, for example, that Uber is this explosive machine of wealth because it's actually there is a hopeful technology end to it, but Uber is really an regulatory arbitrage, right? Like they're destroying the cab medallion system, which was there. I mean, we hate medallions, but medallions are there to protect the wealth of the cab driver who's unskilled.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what I mean. But you create a system. You can create a regulatory protection. You can always bypass it, and it feels like just opening up the distribution from the wealthier to the.
But I think it's
to
like
the poor.
what I think is missing from the comparison is like in the one case we're saying, well, these changes get undone, or we can't pass laws to limit the number of Ubers to protect medallion holders, which localities have done. But like, and then on the other we're saying, okay, but instead there's going to be this alternative where it's like sort of like kumbaya, and we all have this shared values and shared goal, and we're going to watch out for each other, and like let's create that vision. But if we had those values or that intent in this moment, then we wouldn't be going back and forth and having sort of corrective behaviors being undone by, the next government that comes in. So it seems to me like, yes, you have to have buy-in and you have to have a sort of consistent approach to this, but these are things that could we convince people to go express themselves at the poll, or to, be able, if we were able to, have a baseline of education and, shared information in the country, we could constantly make decisions like that, where we're not mad that an innovation like Uber happened, but we're able to sort of harness the power of it, at the local level and not hurt the medallion holders, because we're thinking about it in a way that's like, well, how do we make sure, we do well by all these groups? So I'm not sure that.
It kind of addresses, I mean, so that's the reason I'm very sympathetic, because when you contrast with alternative, what is alternative? Alternative, apparently the presupposition of alternative is a condition that wouldn't create the problem to begin with on the regular. So I'm sympathetic to that point. I don't know, I just feel like it would be nice if we could address how this issue of like this cyclic bumps would play out. If there's any mitigation way that, I don't know, that prevents just the share accumulate power and dominant power bends the rule.
You have something you wanted to say?
I do as well. So you kind of brought in one of Professor Unger's points about how like humans are collectively working kind of towards the designs, almost like in a Nietzschean sense. I didn't understand how that tied into the general theme of your argument. It was about 20% of the way into your brief. You're talking about, you cited one of Professor Unger's points.
Oh yeah, I think with just discussing his vision for the legal profession.
Yes, a little bit, but it almost sounded more like a collective society. We're moving together to kind of refine ourselves into almost a quasi-divine form.
Yeah, I mean, so these were excerpts from a talk that he gave at Brigham Young University, I think. But I think the connection was just that lawyers could play this role of imagining better and better and better and better,
Okay.
or more creative, innovative solutions to all of these problems. And then I tried to, maybe not very well, map that on to what I think is already the execution of that, whether it's thinking of, we have this structure, okay, like, well, can we use the law somehow to forgive, over $1 trillion in debt that's impacting 40 million Americans? Like, to me, that's a fit, because I don't think that most people are going to law school and sort of, getting rubber stamped in like con law and thinking like, oh, well, we could totally have a department, waive this. Like, so I do think that is not quite sort of the unchained like legal practice that you might envision, if that may be wrong. But I think it is sort of between this like description of, lawyers keeping their head down, focusing on becoming judges, or like going to a law firm, and, this more creative vision for the legal field.
Would it be accurate to say then, maybe contrasting with some of the things that we talked about in class, like the evolutionary mindset versus more of a Hegelian or evolutionary mindset? I mean, just putting those labels to your thoughts. You're more in the Hegelian, evolutionary. We're going to continue to refine. I mean, I'm just trying to tie this thought back into what seems to be your argument. Is that how it fits together?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like, I'm not sure I would put it that way, but yeah, that seems to be like sort of in line.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna write that.
And then, let's see. This distinction may not matter, but is there a line you would draw to distinguish your line of thought from a revolutionary line of thought as Professor Unger has laid out? That is to say, we've talked a lot about like having true structural change, and you're saying we don't necessarily need a revolutionary structural change. It'll have these side effects, namely, elites will be upset and things like that. But does a distinction matter for you, or are you more taking a pragmatic framework and saying, I'm gonna I don't need to even draw a line with what's evolutionary versus revolutionary, and I just want to have practical solutions. Is that?
Yeah, I think like one thing that came out of my office hours with Professor Unger, because I had originally framed it as sort of radical versus moderate or incremental change, was a clarification on your end that it's really not the way to think about it as radical versus moderate, but more structural versus non-structural. And so that's sort of one question I'm still probably left with a little. I view most of the things I named as structural change, because I think that when you're impacting tens of millions of one demographic or a people with a policy, no matter what, that's going to have lasting change, and it's going to be structural to the extent that there's a law passed that does it, or there's huge financial dollars put behind it in some area. I think you can't avoid structural change. Now it might be like smaller scale structural change. I don't know if we're going to say it has to be something that affects the country or the state or wherever, but I think all policy is sort of structural change to some extent.
Then I guess just one follow-up then. Does it matter in your framework to define structural change, or it's like, it would be nice, but really it doesn't matter where you draw the line of structural change?
I mean, I think like it matters to some extent because people aren't, up there talking about, ideas that are going to affect 10 people. So I think like within the realm of national discourse, like most of those ideas are structural change. I think like having some sort of maybe parameter and like laying down like, some framework could be helpful. I'm not sure that it would be like a great use of effort for this project, because I think it would take quite a bit of like that. I think is a project itself.
Yeah,
maybe,
sure,
but maybe
yeah.
not. I don't know. Like,
I got you.
yeah, that's kind of like a cop out, but
No, okay, I was just curious.
Further?
I think my question could stem from my own confusion. I feel like there's like, in my head, like two categories of structural change. So one would be the structure in which our society is created, like the governing structure or the laws that we have. And the structural change you seem to be talking about is like how when we make changes to this structure, it impacts these people and their structural change here. And it seems like you're focusing on this end, but I guess my question to you would be, what if the structural elements that our society is founded upon is what's creating, like the minorities rights not to be like respected and like the elites to be at the top? What makes you think that it's this structural change that needs to happen around this? If that makes sense, because it seems like you're
yeah,
saying.
I guess I don't view the first thing as that fixed beyond a very basic set of constraints, because like to me we have like, for example, the amendment process, like that's built in. And my Common Professor, when I was like, we should use this all the time, like it's there for us, like we could be talking about amendments all the time. I would see an amendment to the Constitution as like both of the things you identified, like a structural change like at the very foundational level, like systemically, and then also like it would have some policy change and impact in the real world in which we exist. So I don't know that I view them separate, but I definitely view the project of changing the first thing more comprehensively as not worthwhile compared to adjusting, whatever those agreements and structural sort of underpinnings are, and also focusing on the real changes that are incremental and, pervasive, widespread, whatever is sort of synonym for structural, that may be more appropriate.
So
Yes, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, so I was gonna ask, so, okay, so you're supporting this kind of redistributive model, if we call it that, right? The most obvious critiques, there's a critique from a Marxist perspective, which is that a redistributive model does not change the nature of class so much as it is an attempt by one class to appease another. And then there's a critique, I think, from this class's perspective, which is that a redistributive model might work in an inclusive economy, in an economy where people can participate with different levels of education. But that our economy is moving in a direction where only a select few will actually be able to participate meaningfully in the economy at all. And then in that context, a redistributive model doesn't work, one might argue would not work because for several reasons. First, that you would need such massive redistribution that like it's kind of tough to imagine how that would work. And second, because people need social institutions, and work has been a social institution, probably the primary social institution in this country and in the Western world since the founding of this country, since before that, and that if that is destroyed, then redistribution does not create a new social institution. So how do you address those criticisms? Or do you think?
Well, I guess on the first one, I think like you can come up with a number that makes people happy. It's not all of the money that you need to redistribute. And again, like I think it's a fine critique, yet like I would say like when have we tried a substantial redistribution, even 10% of what the ideal number that you can spout out is, or 5% of what the ideal number, or 1%, you know, like I don't think it's been done. So to me, to say that doing a 10% of the ideal redistribution that we need to do in 5 to 10 years, and then doing it again in those 10 years when if you've made smart investments, if you've, given people the equipment or training or different type of education, which I know Professor Unger also touches on, like maybe we should shift the focus of our education system. Like doing all those things right ideally leads to some level of closing gaps in inequality, empowering both the workforce but also sort of our civic mindedness and access to changing local communities, all of that stuff. Like I think it all goes to, like I'm buying in that it all goes together and that it gets better and better and better. I don't think we have given it a fair shot to say it doesn't work because I don't think we've tried it. And I think we've had some models that, I think I'm missing that sort of data on like that I could find, but on investing in certain communities and the way that sort of impact investing and all these types of things have shown somewhat of it. And obviously there's a limit to these projects, but, and then on the second thing, what'd you say?
Just going to the knowledge economy, the fact that.
Oh yeah, and again, like I think regulating the knowledge economy, whether it's breaking up and disaggregating, sort of using regulatory power in conjunction with the redistributed efforts, like that's the key. Like you can't do one and not the other, but I don't think, that is insurmountable or that we're sort of headed towards like people not having jobs necessarily. And also we could decide like why do we have to decide to continue down the path of technology in the future just to the same extent? Like if it's within us to opt for some radical, totally different social set of arrangements already, why can't we say, all right, like sure, we don't need to all go to Mars, we don't all need to do this, like we can make it whatever we want, much easier than whatever the alternative starting at 0 would be, I would think.
So I think it may help to first establish a few distinctions. So to avoid unnecessary confusion. So I think that first, there's a distinction between the direction of change and the moderation or extremism. That's the issue that we discussed in my office that you referred to. So institutional change or structural change is not necessarily revolutionary change at any given moment. That is, it can be broken up, it can be fragmentary, it can be and it usually is gradual and piecemeal. And so it's important not to mix up these oppositions. That is, the opposition between moderate and extreme or moderate and radical, and between institutional and non-institutional. Now, second, one broad distinction is the distinction between changes that influence the institutional arrangements of the society and changes that don't. Changes that, in that sense, reshape the institutional structure, and changes that involve some reallocation of rights and of access within the established institutional structure. Now, a second distinction, which is very important in these discussions, is the distinction between a progressive orientation that is oriented solely to the demand side of the economy and to corrective redistribution, and an agenda that is oriented to the supply side and to production. So one thing that seems to be noticeably missing from the thinking of contemporary American progressives is a productivist idea. That is, what is the basis of economic growth? You haven't referred to this explosive creativity that exists in the United States within the islands of the knowledge economy. But the question is, who shares in it? And what are the consequences of the chasm that may exist between those islands and the rest of the economy? Now, I think that one thing that I hadn't intended to take the seminar in this direction, but I think it may help for me to sketch out some of the elements of an alternative agenda. Because in a sense, Kevin, the core of your presentation is a defense of the current orientation of the American progressives. You represent them as being limited by circumstance, by the constraints of political reality, and you say, this is the most reasonable bet. So it would help for me to sketch what an alternative direction is. Now, in the United States, in the American context. Now, there's a problem there, because in order to clarify the content of the alternative direction, I need to describe it at some distance from the current arrangements. And then it can begin to seem, quote, radical, when that's not my intention. So I describe it at some distance from the current arrangements for purposes of conceptual clarification. But everything that I'm going to describe could be presented in a form that is closer to what now exists. So I regard this contrast between moderation and extremism, or moderation and radicalness, as something of a red herring, a misunderstanding. Now, having said that then, here are some of the elements that would seem to me to describe a clear contrast to the direction of the American progressive. So my first thesis is there is no progressive project in the United States that is compatible with the present tax take of the American state. That if you were to contrast the United States with Europe, with the European social democracies, the most salient contrast right at the outset is that the European social democracies take in at least 10% more of GDP in aggregate tax take than the American state does. And that's a huge difference with a multitude of practical consequences. Now, I then would say three theses about this. So the first thesis is that everything that influences the primary or original distribution of economic advantage and disadvantage is much more important than whatever establishes influences the secondary or derivative distribution. So what I mean is this. The institutional arrangements of the economy determine the basic distribution. That's what I'm calling the primary distribution. And then once there is that primary distribution of economic and educational advantage and disadvantages, we may seek to correct the consequences of the established market order by retrospective, corrective, compensatory redistribution through progressive taxation on the one side and redistributive social spending or social entitlements on the other. Now, I'm simply saying that whatever we do to influence the primary distribution is much more important than anything that we can do by way of corrective redistribution. And why is that? Now, the fundamental reason for that is that when we try and fix the primary distribution by a retrospective correction through tax and transfer, we are working with a tension, a contradiction between the logic of the established economic arrangements and incentives and the logic of the redistributive correction. That tension is captured in the traditional rhetorical apparatus of the idea that there's a contradiction between equity and efficiency. So if the inequalities that are anchored in the organization of the economy are profound, if there are very deep disparities, the corrective redistribution would have to be massive in order to compensate for them. And long before it reached the requisite magnitude, it would begin to undermine the established economic arrangements and incentives and exact an unacceptable cost in foregone economic output. So the practical consequence is that corrective redistribution is by its nature very limited in what it can achieve. It can attenuate inequalities, but it cannot fundamentally reverse the direction of the established economic incentives and arrangements. Now we come to the second principle. Yes.
Just to clarify, with primary redistribution on the economic side, do you consider like the baked-in parts of private law and those elements being part of primary? It's like property, our system of property, things like that.
Yes, but way down the road. So it's not mysterious what I mean. So take the idea of the knowledge economy. So the knowledge economy exists as an island, as an exclusive fringe. And the vast majority of the labor force is excluded from it and condemned to some kind of make work, imprisoned in relatively retrograde business, small and medium-sized firms and shops. That's an example of a structural chasm in the economy. And what I'm saying is that there's no amount of corrective redistribution that can compensate for that, because the corrective redistribution would have to be massive. And it can't be massive because there's this limit to how far you can go in mounting a contradiction between the economic logic that results from your established system and the attempt to correct it after the fact. So someone could say, well, it's wonderful to have this creative economy that has these creative explosions, and then it'll produce a lot of wealth, and we'll distribute the wealth more broadly through this corrective redistribution. And what I'm saying is that's a very limited operation, because if the chasm between the vanguard and the rear guard is too profound, the amount of the redistribution has to be massive. And it can't be massive without exacting an unacceptable economic cost. So that's the fundamental realistic objection, as it were. It doesn't mean that corrective redistribution is ineffective or impossible. It simply means that it's limited in what it can achieve. So that's the first thesis. Now, the second thesis, go down the hierarchy. And what should be our thinking about then the role of the budget of the government, on both its revenue-raising side, taxation, and its spending side, public spending and social entitlements. It's not that it doesn't have a role, it does have a role, even though the role is subsidiary to what I'm calling structural change. Now, here's the paradox. On paper, the American tax system is more progressive than the tax systems of the European social democracies. Because unlike them, it relies very heavily on the progressive taxation of personal income. The European social democracies rely primarily on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or some functional equivalent to it. So for example, France doesn't have a value-added tax, but it has a crazy quilt of taxes that achieve a similar effect in the aggregate. Now, how are we to explain this paradox that the society, the advanced society that is most unequal, the United States, has on paper the most progressive tax system? And the more egalitarian social democracies of Europe have a tax system that is primarily based on a more regressive tax. And to my mind, the explanation is the following. What matters to the redistributive effect of the tax system in the short term is not how progressive it is on the revenue raising side. It's simply the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. That's what matters. And the reason why the European social democracies achieve, through corrective redistribution, a more progressive effect is very simple. It's that they take in much more in taxes, and then everything they have lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget, they gain in double on the spending side through heavy investment in education and health and so forth. Now, and what's the relation of the regressive taxation, the value-added tax to this? The relation is that the value-added tax, or some functional equivalent to it, is conceptually the most neutral possible tax. Neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. So it's like you have the economy as an input-output table. What this tax does is to take a constant amount of the transfer of every input into an output. It does not affect the system of relative prices when it's truly general. And for that reason, it makes it possible to maximize the public revenue while minimizing the economic trauma of the taxpayer. That's the practical reason. So that's what explains this paradox that I just described. Now, we know what happens in the real world. What happens is that the progressive politicians at election time all want to say they're in favor of progressive taxation. Why? They know that it has a marginal effect on the economic outcomes. But it seems to function for them as a way of signaling whose side they're on. I think that's why they do this. And even though they know that the practical effect is modest. So this results in an accusation. I accuse them. I say, there you are preferring redistributive pieties to transformative effects. And you failed to explain this to the people so that they could understand it. Yes.
I was gonna ask maybe the flip side of that question, which
Yes.
is, does the regressive VAT type taxes then have less of an ideological penalty on resistance from the dominant classes as
Yeah,
well?
so take the American debate about taxation, it's very revealing. So the right, the business interests like flat taxation, the value-added tax, because they imagine it as a way of limiting the tax take. And the left doesn't like it because it's not progressive. But no one imagines what the real thing is, which is that the seemingly regressive tax can be used to elevate the tax take. That's what the Europeans do, huh? And so in the short term, the right is always going to be in favor of these flat taxes, and the left is always going to be against them. And they're always going to act as if this is what matters. But this is not what matters. What matters is what's the effect on the aggregate tax take and how it is spent. Now we come to the third principle down the hierarchy. And the third, yes.
Sorry, before we get to the, I missed the critical piece here. How does, could you just reiterate briefly, how does a flat tax structure ultimately result in less, in more redistribution of value-added tax?
Because it simply allows you to take in more taxes with less economic diffusion.
I see.
It's very simple. It's neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. So you can increase the tax take while minimizing the economic trauma. That's the reason. So any tax that has a differential effect on relative prices,
Right.
which is most taxes,
Yes.
then creates economic trauma. It begins to undermine the system of established arrangements and the incentives to invest, save, and employ. And then people begin to say, if you increase this tax too much, its effect, you're going to pay a price in foregone economic growth. That's what the editorials of the business press say. Every time there's a proposal to have progressive taxation, the Wall Street Journal will have editorials denouncing the progressive taxation is imposing a huge economic cost and so forth.
Can I rephrase what you're saying in detail? So are you saying that because of value-added tax only taxes, the actual, the kind of, I guess, the profit margin sort of, because of that, it never disincentivizes production?
It has no influence on relative prices.
I see.
So if it is truly general, if it is impersonal, because as I said, it takes a constant proportion of every transfer of an input into an output. So it is a burden on the system as a whole, but it's a neutral burden. It doesn't influence the relation between the price of this and the price of that. That's why it makes it possible to achieve more tax take with less trauma.
Right.
And this is counterintuitive. So you would think in a democracy, one of the roles of the statesman would be to explain things to the people and not to revel in the consequences of paradoxes, because then there's no solution to the real problems. Yes.
But isn't the VAT tax regressive? in a
Yeah,
way?
yeah.
So, I mean, isn't that why the progressives are against it?
Of
Because
course, that's why they're against it.
right, but it's a tax on the poorest people in the country. That's why they're
Yes,
against it.
but that's not the point of this line of argument. The point of this line of argument, first of all, understand why an indirect tax on consumption is regressive. It's regressive because poor people consume a proportionately much larger amount of their income. That's why it's regressive. So an indirect transaction-oriented tax on consumption is going to be regressive by definition. And and the argument is that's terrible, but it's not what matters most. What matters most is simply how much the government is taking in so they can have an elaborate health system, an education system, and everything that it's losing, as I said, by way of progressivity, on the revenue-raising side of the budget, it's gaining in double on the spending side. So there's this transformation, but it's complicated because it's counterintuitive. So you people right here at this table, Harvard Law students and so forth, are having trouble understanding it. How are the people to understand it? So this is part of the stuff of real political life. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like even if like it makes sense to a politician, like even if he understands that what he really wants is just like votes from the people, from this generation, it seems like this to have this regime right now in the US to start over, the education effect, the investment effect is gonna take a long time to come into actual effect, and this generation, people who are voting right now will not be.
I don't think so. I think it's not, I mean, it's a little complicated, but it's not an insurpassable mystery. There is a pedagogy that could explain this to everyone, so that everyone in the street could understand it, but no such attempt is made. So, and it's so as you say, we'll give you a regressive tax, but the aggregate tax take will be much larger. Who's in favor of that? As you said, the progressives are against it because it's regressive. And the business interests are against it because they don't want a higher tax take. So everyone is against it. But we want to be in favor of it. Okay, so now the third principle. We're going down the ladder. So the third principle is, it doesn't mean that there's no role for progressive taxation. There is a role for progressive taxation. Now, what are the two most obvious targets of progressive taxation in principle? First, the hierarchy of standards of living in society, which is determined by what people spend on themselves and fail to invest, right? That's what determines the hierarchy of standards of living. The second target of progressive taxation is the accumulation and exercise of economic power. Money not for consumption, but money to control people. That's the second target. Now, let me say right at the outset, the second target is much harder to reach through the tax system than the first target, because it's intimately entangled with the institutional organization of the economy. But there is a way to reach it. A blunt instrument to reach it, which is to reach it at the moment of death through a high tax on the hereditary transmission of property and on anticipated inheritance through gifts and survivals. That's the best way in which the tax system can reach it. Now, I remind you, not many years ago, the two richest men in the United States at that time, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, conducted a national campaign in defense of the estate tax. And they took out full-page advertisements in the American newspapers in an attempt to convince their fellow citizens to maintain the estate tax at the highest possible level. And they failed. So I'm not saying it's easy, because the majority of Americans fail to support the high estate tax. And the two richest people were the ones who were defending it. So now what about the other target of the hierarchy of standards of living? So the income tax is a very defective tax because it is a hybrid tax that doesn't hit squarely either of these two targets, the hierarchy of standards of living or the exercise of economic power. And all over the world, rich people basically don't pay the income tax. The income tax is a tax on the salaries of the middle class. That's what it basically is. It's not a tax on the returns to capital earned by rich people. And that's not true not just in the United States, but all over the world. So it's not a good tax. So what's the alternative to the income tax as a tax that would achieve this direct progressive effect? It's an individualized tax on consumption. Let me explain to you what that is. It's sometimes called the Caldor tax because it was theorized by Nicholas Caldor, one of Keynes's disciples. And it is a tax that is beloved by many of the public finance experts and tax professors in the United States. They write articles about it, defending it and so forth, but to no effect. They haven't persuaded anyone. So what it is a tax on the difference between the total income of an individual, not just returns to labor, but also returns to capital, and the invested saving. So that difference between total income and invested saving is what an individual spends in himself, in his standard of living. That's the difference. And the tax is then organized on a steep progressive slope. So you said, if someone earns beneath a certain threshold, he doesn't pay anything. He gets something from the government. That's what the Americans call the negative income tax. As he begins to go up the slope, the marginal rate rises steeply. And at the highest level, the marginal rate can be a multiple of 100%. Because unlike the income tax, this tax has no limit to the top marginal rate. You could say, if you spend beyond a certain level of luxury living, for every dollar you spend, you have to pay 2 or 3 or 4 to the state. In other words, the top marginal rate is 400%. So there's no limit. The sky's the limit. The only limit is political will. There's no technical difficulty in the administration of this tax. Because from a technical point of view of implementation, its difficulty is exactly the same as the income tax. Because whatever you don't demonstrate as invested saving counts as if it were spent, and therefore is taxable. So there's no technical difficulty. And the consequence is you can have a tax that is steeply progressive. That would be really progressive. And what I would say is, if the progressive politicians were sincerely and genuinely interested in redistribution through the tax system, this is the tax they would promote, not the income tax. Yes?
Oh, so I have a question. So if we implement this, doesn't this incentivize people to spend less, therefore affecting their economy,
Yes.
circulating less money?
No, well, this is like a kind of anti-Keynesian argument. So it's not leading people to spend less. It's taking the very, very rich, who only spend a tiny fraction of their gains anyway, and imposing a high tax on them, just on them. So you can calibrate the steepness of this curve of the marginal rate as much as you want. I'm simply trying to illustrate that this argument that I'm making is not an argument against progressive taxation. It is according a role to progressive taxation way down the ladder. So it's a secondary role. But if you want to be progressive, this is the way to do it. And that's not what happens, of course. So that's on the tax system. So let's say that's the first element in this program. And there's a hierarchical relation among these three principles, because the most important of the three is obviously the first. What influences the primary distribution of income overshadows anything that you can do to reshape the secondary distribution. Okay. Now, second line is the productivist project. So what's the basic problem there? There's a new advanced practice of production, we call it the knowledge economy. What used to be the vanguard, which was industrial mass production, conventional industry, is declining. It survives as the vestige of an earlier vanguard or as a satellite to the new vanguard. As a satellite to the new vanguard, it takes over the commoditized or routinized parts of the production of the vanguard. And usually that's not in the United States. So the advanced tech companies bifurcate their process of production into two parts. There's the creative and lucrative part that they keep for themselves, and then they learn how to routinize or commoditize parts of their production process. And those are the parts that they subcontract to firms and workers in remote parts of the world with lower wages, lower tax take, and so forth. Tax and labor arbitrage. So this situation has overwhelming consequences for the country because it means it has two consequences. First consequence is economic slowdown, stagnation, deacceleration of the rise of productivity. So, there's a discourse now in the United States that goes under the label secular stagnation. This is a label of the 1930s. That it's somehow natural for there to be slowdown because the technological innovations of today are much less transformative than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. And in my mind, this is absurd because what could be more revolutionary as a technology than artificial intelligence? Nothing, conceptually. The much more straightforward reason for this deacceleration of economic growth and productivity is that the most advanced practice of production is denied to the vast majority of firms and of workers. So they don't get access to the most advanced practice. That's reserved for this elite. So it has those and then it has overwhelming consequences for inequality, because inequality comes to be anchored in this hierarchical segmentation of the production system, this chasm that deepens between the vanguards and the rear guards. And as I said in my first principle, if the chasm is too deep, corrective redistribution by tax and transfer will never be enough to redress it. The only way to redress the structural problem is to generate a structural solution. So what's the general name of the structural solution? The general name of the structural solution is somehow find a way to transform the knowledge economy for the few that we have, the insular knowledge economy, into a knowledge economy for the many. Now, easier said than done, but that's the task. So, and now it's a worldwide dilemma. So, the development economics of the second half of the 20th century prescribed conventional industrialization as the shortcut to economic growth. Now that shortcut has stopped working, and one country after another in the world is deindustrialized. And with the decline of mass production, the middle part of the job structure has collapsed, that was the basis of the social compact that sustained these societies in the middle 20th century. And we have this division between the people in the vanguard and everyone else. Everyone else is basically consigned to some kind of make work. And that's then the situation. So it's necessary then to have a productivist project, which instead of simply dealing with redistributive rights, correction, anti-discrimination, and so forth, deals with the structural causes of this inequality, which is the insular character of the new vanguardism. Now, is this possible? Well, it happened before in American history. So, in the beginning of the 19th century, when the Americans rejected the path of English agrarian concentration, they established family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics. They distributed the lands to the family farmers on the agrarian frontier. They organized agricultural extension through the land-grant colleges to bring the advanced science and practice to the producer. They organized a system to ensure agriculture against its risks, a combination of price risk and climate risk. And the result was the most efficient system of family-scale entrepreneurial agriculture that the world had ever seen. When the Americans did this in the first half of the 19th century, they weren't regulating the agricultural market. They were creating a kind of agricultural market that had never existed before. And I'm saying this is the kind of thing that they would now have to do in spades in every part of the economy, because the knowledge economy is multi-sectoral. It exists in every sector of production, but in each sector it exists only as a fringe. That's the problem. And no distributive policy can substitute for a solution to this problem. So it has to be addressed. So let's say that's the second large project, which I'm describing in a provocative way, relatively distant from current arrangements, but it can be broken up into, it must be broken up into steps, into pieces, for it to be feasible. Now then comes a third theme. The third theme is education. So just as there is a productive dualism in the United States, there is an educational dualism. There are two different educational systems that coexist in the United States. There's an elite system of the elite private schools and the top tier of public schools under the influence of the leading American educational ideologist, John Dewey, progressive education. And then for the rest, there's a lower tier of this kind of babysitting disciplinary operation of the ordinary public schools. And in a society that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States, or like my country, Brazil, you have to have a system that reconciles the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. And so you need a mechanism to determine what works, what the results are, school by school and student by student. You need redistribution of resources and even staff within the federal system from richer places to poorer places, so that the quality of the education that a young person receives not depend on the happenstance of where he's born. And that means that school finance cannot be based on local municipal finance. That's intolerable, it's unacceptable. And finally, you need some corrective mechanism in the federation through federal cooperation. When a local school system repeatedly fails to rise above the minimum accepted threshold, to intervene, to take it over, to fix it, and to return it fixed. Not by some federal intervention, but by some type of cooperation within the federal system. And of course, you need a different, as the basis for the knowledge economy and for an energized democracy, you need a different method, a different model of teaching and learning. So in the broadest terms, I would say it should focus on analysis and synthesis on capabilities rather than on the mastery of dead information. With respect to information, because these capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content, it should prefer selective depth to encyclopedic shallowness. So it should be theme-oriented or project-oriented. In its social base, it should be cooperative, rather than juxtaposing individualism and authoritarianism, as happens in the traditional classroom. And the fourth characteristic, and of course the most difficult, is that it should be dialectical. Everything should be taught at least twice, from contrasting points of view. Nothing should be taught just once, because this is the only way to liberate the mind. And now, an educational project like this is a project of national liberation. And it's not going to be imposed by a little clique of despots at the top. It has to be the joint work of thousands of schools and teachers. It has to be a collective movement in the country. And this is what I would say is like a third axis. Now then, the fourth axis is the energizing of American democracy. And so that change no longer depend on crisis, because all the democracies that exist in the world are flawed democracies, low energy democracies that make change depend on crisis. So no trauma, no transformation, that's their rule. Franklin Roosevelt, as I said in an earlier class, he had a war and a depression as his allies. And even then he had trouble because the system was designed to give him trouble. So what are the institutional elements of a high energy democracy? The first is raising the temperature of politics. That is, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. Because only a high temperature politics can be rich in structural content. Now, the premise of conservative statecraft and conservative political science is that politics must be either hot and anti-institutional, or it must be cold and institutional. But it can't be both hot and institutional. So the idea is, at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. That's the conservative idea. And in fact, the truth is that by the convergent effect of a set of arrangements, you can slowly elevate the temperature of democratic politics, the level of organized political mobilization. The rules about money in politics and the financing of campaigns, the rules about access to the means of mass communication in favor of the political parties and the organized social movements. So you can say, no one can buy television time. Television time is allocated for free to the political parties and social movements as a condition of the revocable licenses under which the media companies do their business. Electoral regimes, the question of mandatory voting, and so forth. Now, second set of institutional arrangements, to hasten the pace of politics. Because you should be able to say about democratic politics what Karl Popper said about science. The aim is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. Acceleration. And acceleration means that impasses between the political branches are resolved as quickly as possible. So there are two architectural principles in the American constitutional arrangements. There's the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, the many sources of power in the government. And there's the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics through the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances. The Americans almost universally think that the liberal principle and the conservative principle are inseparable. But they're not inseparable. They're connected by intention, by design. So it's very easy to affirm the liberal principle, but to get rid of the conservative one. For example, you could say that when there is a deadlock between the political branches, either of the two political branches, the legislature or the executive, could unilaterally call early elections to resolve the impasse. But the exercise of the constitutional prerogative to call by early elections would always require the convoking branch of government to pay the political price of running the electoral risk, because the election would always be bilateral for both branches. I'm just giving you an example. But by any such device, and there are several possible devices, you could transform the regime, the constitutional regime, into a motor for the acceleration of politics. Now then is the third principle, the third set of innovations, has to do with the relation between strong initiative by the central government and initiatives by the local governments, the states and the municipalities. The basic intuitive idea is that as a society goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets, allowing parts of itself to generate counter models of the national future. And so the states become, in fact, the laboratories of experimentation that the Federalist Papers say they're supposed to be, but that the conventional form of federalism prevents them from being. And now it's very interesting that this idea that strong central initiative and local devolution are not opposites, that you can have more of both depending on how you shape the relation between divided and concurrent powers, applies even in unitary states like the United Kingdom or France, not just in federal systems. And in fact, in some respects, it's easier in a unitary state than in a federal system. Because in a unitary state, there is no presumption that all parts of the state must enjoy the same level of divergence at the same time. So, for example, the government of the United Kingdom can make a deal with Scotland that is different from the deal that it makes with Wales. And this way it can allow for very wide divergence. And the fourth set of institutional innovations would be innovations that enhance representative democracy with elements of direct or participatory democracy at the local level or nationally through plebiscites and referenda. Now, just a practical observation. It seems that the American progressives, we all agree that the place to begin is not the second set of innovations, the constitutional setup of the government, because that's sacrosanct in the United States. The Constitution is part of the national identity and so forth. The American progressives generally seem to believe that the place to begin is the first set of innovations, the temperature of politics, like the relation of money to politics. I think that's a mistake myself, a practical mistake. I believe that the place to begin is the third set of innovations, the energizing of American federalism, because the federal idea has very wide appeal in the United States, cutting across divisions between right and left. And it is the most natural place to begin. Now, finally, I would say then there's the fifth element in this program. I'm giving an example of an alternative American progressive program. The fifth element is, what's the basis of social cohesion in such a society? If it can no longer depend on consensus, on similarity of experience and of background, on a high level of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. The basis is the multiplication of forms of collective action. People doing many things together. That's the basis of, so that cohesion is not something that's inherited, it's something that is created through collaborative, purposeful activity. And so it begins in education, because the basis of the school is cooperative. Then you could say the provision of public services. The state shouldn't be the only provider of public services. The state should help organize independent civil society for it to partner with the state through cooperatives of educators and health providers in the competitive and experimentalist provision of public service. It's not the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. It's this idea of the cooperation of the state with civil society outside the state and outside the market. And another example of this multiplication of forms of collective action is an idea of social service. So you could say every able-bodied adult should have at least two positions, a position in the production system and a responsibility in what we could call the caring economy, to help take care of other people beyond the bounds of family selfishness. And this can be done, for example, early in everyone's life, in the formative period, or later in part of the working year. And if we revoke the subversive idea of the volunteer army, which ought to be anathema to Republican ideals. The army has to be the nation in arms. It's not part of the nation paid for by the others to fight for them. An army of poor people to fight the wars of rich people. That can't be the army. The army has to be the whole country in arms. And then those who are exempt from military service, because not everyone is necessary, then become subject, for example, to mandatory social service during the same period. So I'm giving you examples of five directions. Now, and as I said, the problem is that in order to be clear, I've had to describe them as if they were much more radical than they in fact are, because all of them could be described as forms that bring them close to what already exists. But so this is what I offer now as an example of what I'm calling a structural and productivist alternative to the orthodox views of the American progressives. The question is not how far we go at any one moment. The question is, in what direction do we go? That's the question. Now, of course, every programmatic project is just the reverse side of a coalition. That is, you can always formulate it in two registers. So one register is a set of institutional ideas. The other register is as the proposal of an alliance of social interests. of class interests. And the same is true here. Now, there are certain issues in the United States, these are the so-called wedge issues, that help inhibit the formation of a transracial progressive majority. So a classic example of this is the orthodox approach to the relation between race and class in the United States, in which race is treated as a threshold issue separated from class. It wasn't always that way because, for example, in the period of Reconstruction, in the years that immediately followed the Civil War, there was at least a brief attempt to connect race and class. And Du Bois theorized that as a theorist of a form of economic reconstruction. So the characteristic example of the consequences of this separation of race from class is affirmative action. So what can you say by way of criticizing it? What you can say is first, it generates benefits that are in inverse proportion to the need for them. That is, its most undoubted achievement has been to consolidate the existence of a black professional and business class. It benefits less the black working class, especially of public employees like policemen and firemen. And least of all, of course, it benefits the underclass of poor blacks caught in the secondary part of the labor market and filling the American prisons, mass incarceration. The second defect is that it separates the black elite, the black leadership, from the mass of poor blacks, and co-opts or assimilates this black leadership into the established order. And the third defect is, of course, that it offends the white working class majority of the country, which with some justice believes itself to be the victim of a conspiracy between the white elites and the virtual representatives and their virtual representatives, the black leadership. So what would be an alternative? An alternative would be, let's begin by separating the problem of individualized racial discrimination from the collective promotion of the disadvantaged. So the collective promotion of the disadvantaged is a structural problem. And you could say individualized racial discrimination should be criminalized, as it is in many countries, but it should be separated from the collective problem. And with respect to the collective problem of promotion, what should count is actual disadvantage. The substrate will always be class, but class as aggravated by a series of other disadvantages, such as racial stigma. And then those groups that are caught in a situation of exclusion and subjugation from which they are unable to escape by the forms of collective political and economic action that are available to them, we then help escape. We provide the escape route. But we don't confuse these two objectives of the individualized discrimination with the structural issue of being trapped in a circumstance from which they can't escape. So this is what I would say now. Of course, I'm a foreigner, I'm not an American, so I'm describing what someone with this form of imagination would say to the American progressives. Say, here's the alternative direction. I don't condemn you for not going many steps at a time in this direction, but I criticize you for not changing the direction. And if you don't know what the direction is, then no wind will help you sail to the port. So it's essential to identify the direction and to select the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. So that was my extended argument now, by way of giving more flesh to the idea of an alternative. So we still have some time. But I think that at least the lines of the contract should now be clearer. And just so just so we don't leave inexplicit the relation here to our main theme in the course. So with regard to all these questions that are raised by an alternative like this one, the question of the institutional details becomes crucial. Everything is in the details. And where are the details? The details are in law. And that's why that's the claim, that the most important vocation of legal thought is this vocation of speaking to the country about its institutional future, and not whispering into the ears of the judge about how he should decide hard cases. And so it's a completely different conception of the mission of legal thought as being equipped to address the structural problems of the nation. Yes?
I find this idea of the law being a detailed institutional form of life really interesting and compelling, and the idea that we should study the law too, because the institutional creativity and imagination comes from the detailed form of law. What I would like to ask though is, if you see a contradiction in your style and approach to the subject matter, is highly abstract. It seems very removed from the details, and the philosophy itself, which is the idea that the details are critical. So I guess
No, it's a question of degree, because so to have a full programmatic argument, you need to be able to operate simultaneously at many different levels of generality and abstraction. So I outlined this project, an American project, to give a more comprehensive and coherent idea of the direction. But that doesn't replace the need, with respect to each of the elements, then to zero in on the details. But I think you can already see the open horizon of these details. What doesn't make sense is to do the opposite, is to discuss just a bunch of details and not to have a conception of the general direction. You have to have an idea of the direction.
so, but isn't part of what you're arguing that the idea of the direction comes from the details, or no?
No, I don't think that's quite that way. The direction always transcends the details. The details are like a down payment, right? And in every transformative discourse, there is a prophetic element. So actually, the way in which I've just presented this alternative could be criticized as being a kind of this middle distance from the present. It wasn't very close to the present, but it wasn't very far away either. And the justification for preferring the middle distance in this expository role is because it serves the uses of clarification. But in the practical discourse of transformation, of transformative politics, the middle distance has a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that it is too far away from what exists to see feasible, but it is too close to arouse enthusiasm. And so, if the discourse of transformative practice, we prefer to combine the very close with the very distant. So the discourse of transformative politics, the rhetoric of transformative politics, is at once practical and prophetic. Whereas the expository logic, as in this academic situation here, is to organize ideas, and therefore to prefer the middle distance as I did just now. And I think the problem is that it's easy to misunderstand any given statement as if it were the outline of a blueprint. And that's not what I think a programmatic idea is. It's about a sequence, a succession. It's not architecture, it's music. And any trajectory we're thinking about can be explored at points that's relatively close to what exists or relatively far from what exists. And it doesn't really matter, so long as you understand what the sequence is. And so what's difficult is to hold in your mind at the same time all these different levels. But that's what would be necessary in an argument about alternatives. Now, I also think that all of this has an immense epistemic significance for understanding. And I return to my point. How do we understand anything in the world? We understand always a phenomenon by understanding what it can become. That's what understanding is. Insight into a phenomenon is insight into its transformative possibilities. We understand the phenomena in nature by grasping what it can next become under certain interventions or provocations. And if we don't have transformative insight, we don't have any insight. We just stare at something. And I think that is the characteristic of a great deal of established social science and discourse about society. It's a kind of rationalistic representation or reconstruction of the existent without any transformative insight, without insight into the relation between the actual and the adjacent possible, which is so this kind of, so I would say that you can't really understand a society like the United States unless you have an idea of what it could next become, and you have a richer sense of the adjacent possible. So there's a direct relation between the development of programmatic ideas of this kind and the ability to interpret the reality of the national circumstance. Yes?
Is it fair to understand that, so maybe one of the things that's missing from the current landscape is that we're too focused on differences between two discrete, concrete camps of thoughts, and we're thinking about compromises, but your idea is sort of like there could be alternatives that we are not even imagining, that it's not really in the middle.
Well, for sure, there'll be alternatives. But there are many levels of this discussion. So, for example, what is the fundamental difference now? How should we understand now the difference between right and left? So, for the most part, the contemporary left thinks of itself as being the party of the people who accord priority to equality, against the background of the established institutional arrangements. So if you combine the egalitarian profession of faith with the institutional conservatism or skepticism, what's the result of that combination? The result is that you think the characteristic activity of the progressives is to justify and propose and support these ameliorative, corrective forms of redistribution. So, for example, the theories of justice that are advanced in the academy, like Rawls's theory of justice, are these pseudo-philosophical props to corrective redistribution. Because if you thought that the task was to reimagine the structure, you wouldn't think that way at all. You wouldn't be concerned with these principles of corrective redistribution. That would appear to be completely secondary. So that's what, and now, so what is the distinction between right and left on some other view? I would say there are two fundamental distinctions. The first distinction is whether you pursue your interests and ideals, or the interests and ideals of the existing classes, within the horizon of the established institutional arrangements, or beyond that horizon. Is there structural ambition or is there not structural ambition? That's the first difference. And the second difference, now at the level of ideals or goals, is stated in the most abstract terms. The second difference is, do you think it's natural for life to be small? So the conservative is the one who believes that it's natural for human life, for most people, to be small. There's an elite of adventurers, entrepreneurs, heroes, geniuses, saints. Everyone else is small, except when there's some kind of emergency like a war, and then they're temporarily rescued from this littleness. I think the left are the ones who believe it's not natural for human life to be small. And we can all ascend and become bigger together to some higher. So what to my mind should define what it means to be a leftist is the combination of these two beliefs. You defy the structural constraints, you deny that they're the insurpassable horizon, and you affirm the vocation of ordinary men and women to ascend to a higher form of life and power. That combination is what's crucial. I think that was the real aim